I'm on a quest to read every fighting fantasy gamebook. Hey everyone, I'm Nev, and I'd like you to join me as we read through all 59 of the original fighting fantasy gamebooks. This is my intro video. I'm going to be talking about two things. The first is an introduction to what these gamebooks are. I'll give a little bit of the history and how they work, so feel free to skip that if you know all that stuff already. The second part, I'm going to lay out how I'm going to approach this project, which books I'll be reading, how I'll read them, and my review template. Hey, Editing Nev here. You may be wondering, why do I want to do this project in the first place? Well, there's just something special about these books. They came out when I was a teenager, around that same time that D&D was like massive. I mean, when D&D was first massive before it kind of declined, and now it's back to being massive. But I never had the money back then to buy them, so I've never read the entire series, and these are now incredibly rare. I keep my eye out for them at book fairs, and I'm talking about book fairs where there are like 100,000 books, and you're lucky to find one of these. They're very distinctive because of the green spines, and there are groups on Facebook of collectors like the Gamebook AU and NZ group that I'm a part of, and that's actually where I got most of my green spines from. And in actual fact, I don't have them all. The higher number ones go for hundreds of dollars, and I mean like $400 or $500. I do have some of those in the 50s, like this is number 52, Night Dragon. So this is like a $200 book. And so part of the reason for me making this series is because some people will never have access to these books unless they spend a lot of money. So at least I can share that with people. Anyway, back to the video. So first, what are fighting fantasy game books? I'm glad you asked. First of all, we need to go back to what came before, and that means choose your own adventure. This is a series of books that were first published in 1979, and there's a ton of them. I think there were over 180 of them, and then there were also spin-offs. Anyway, the idea is that you read a passage in the book, and then it comes to a choice, and then you need to decide what you're going to do. And then you turn to a different page depending on your choice. So here in this example, you read a passage about some sort of cave, and then you have a choice to make whether you decide to start back home or decide to wait. So it tells you to turn to page 4 or page 5, depending on your choice, and then you do so. And then it tells you what happens, and then you get more choices, and so on and so on. It's kind of like a poor man's computer game. And don't forget, in 1979, very few people had access to home computers, or even computers in universities. And yes, there are instances of books with this kind of branching narrative structure from earlier times. There's one actually from 1930. But these are the books that really popularized the concept. The original run of this series was published up to 1998, and there were lots of imitators. For example, TSR, the makers of Dungeons & Dragons, came out with their own series of books called Endless Quest. This was published in 1982, and they had the same sort of branching narrative structure, although in their case, the passages often went on for multiple pages before getting to make a choice. But in the same year, 1982, Fighting Fantasy was born with the publication of The Warlock of Firetop Mountain. Fighting Fantasy was created by Steve Jackson and Ian Livingstone, and they had a shop in the UK called the Games Workshop, and they were the distributors of D&D in the UK. And this was new. This was more like D&D in a book, with actual game mechanics, like there's character statistics and there's dice rolling, and of course fighting monsters. So I'll briefly go over how fighting fantasy books work. The rules compared to D&D are vastly simplified. I've got the Warlock of Firetop Mountain here. I won't go through all the rules, but I'll just turn to the adventure sheet. That is a typical adventure sheet for most of the books. And rather than defacing this, I'll show you this particular sheet I've got here. This is a blank sheet you can print out from online. You can ignore most of this sheet. The three most important things are these stats: the skill, the stamina, and the luck. And when you create your character, you have to roll. So for skill, you roll a single die. That's a terrible roll. And then you add 6. So my initial skill is 7. Then for stamina, you roll 2 dice. I've got 9 there, and you add 12. So that equals 21. And then for luck, again, you roll a single die. That's 3, you add 6, and that's 9. So those are my initial scores. So you can tell from those mechanics that the worst scores you can get are 7, 13, and 7, and the best scores are 12, 24, and 12. Then there's some other stuff on the sheet. You know, you've got a shield and sword and you can write all that stuff in. Sometimes you pick up stuff while you're adventuring. You've got some gold, jewels, and depending on the book, they can be useful or not. And then generally most books you also start out with 10 provisions. So you can usually use provisions to restore your stamina if you have been hurt by something. So as you adventure, you generally lose stamina because you're fighting monsters and you're falling down pits. And you can actually use your provisions to eat and rest and get some of those stamina points back. They're like hit points in D&D. And then when you come across a monster, so for example in this passage you're coming across an orc. He has a skill of 6 and a stamina of 5. So you're supposed to copy that over to one of these boxes here. So I'll put 6 and 5 here. Now, combat is fairly straightforward. You roll 2 dice for the monster and you add it to their skill. So I rolled 5 and I add it to 6, so that's 11. And then I roll for me. So I got a 10, so 17. So I beat his attack of 11, so therefore he loses 2 stamina. So he goes down to 3. And then you just keep going. So he rolled a 3, so he's got 9, and I rolled a 6, so I got 13, so I beat him, so he's down to 1, and so on until he is dead. Now, if he manages to get more than me, I'll take stamina off here, I'll go down to 19 there. If your attack scores match, so if he rolled a 3, which is 9, and I rolled a 2, which is also 9, then we would not hit each other. There are some additional details about combat, but I won't bother going into those. You can use luck to increase the damage that you've done to a monster or decrease the damage that they've done to you. Luck is an interesting one. Occasionally you'll come across a passage where something happens and you have to test your luck. And so it's basically rolling 2 dice and seeing if what you roll is less than your luck score. But every time you do that, you have to take 1 luck off. And usually in the book it will say, if you're lucky, turn to this section. If you're unlucky, turn to another section. Like you've fallen down a pit or you've managed to avoid falling down a pit. Otherwise, the same mechanic from the Choose Your Own Adventure books is used, where you read a passage and then you come to a choice and you turn not to a page but to a section. So in this case, if I go down east, I turn to 278, and here it's just a very short passage saying, oh, there's a door. Okay, do you want to try and charge down the door, or would you rather just go back to the junction that you were at? And so these shorter sections make for a much more detailed series of choices. In a Choose Your Own Adventure book, you may only make about 20 choices before you reach some sort of ending, whereas in Fighting Fantasy, you'll generally make at least 100 choices before you get to some sort of ending. And most of the Fighting Fantasy books have 400 sections. Some have more, some have less, but they came up with a nice round 400 for the first book, and that kind of continued on for the rest. There's only a few of the Fighting Fantasy books that don't have 400 sections. So now I'll tell you about how I'm planning to read and review these books. In the past, I really haven't been all that strict about actually playing the books as a game. I mean, when I was younger, when I was like a teenager, I did actually play them as proper games. But nowadays, I tend to just read through every possible path. I'm interested in the story, and I'm interested in how the design works, the mechanics of the actual game, because they do tweak things. As they went through publishing more, the authors would come up with different kind of game mechanics, like adding spells or doing really interesting stuff. But for this project, I'm going to have 1 or 2 good attempts at playing the books with absolutely no cheating, very strictly by the rules, let the dice fall where they may, and no taking back a choice. And after doing that, I'll read through the entire thing following every single path, which in most cases means 400 sections, which depending on the book can involve quite a lot of bookmarks, or otherwise known as fingers, as you follow through every single option. It's alleviated somewhat because in these books they're often structured such that there are pinch points. As a simple example, you may be walking down a tunnel and there's a door on the side of the tunnel, and you can either go in the door or you can go down the tunnel. If you go in the door, there's often a monster and then some sort of search for treasure, so there's a few different possibilities that happen within that room, but then ultimately you come back out to the tunnel. So with your finger in the kind of continue down the tunnel option, you can go through all the different possibilities and you will probably eventually come back to that point. Sometimes that doesn't happen and there'll be something in the room or that path that takes you off in a totally different direction, and you just have to keep track with multiple bookmarks. Eventually, they usually come back, but it may be a long way before they come back to the same point. And it's really interesting to see how the different authors are more or less complex in this kind of design structure. Ian Livingstone's books tend to be simpler. It's like that room where you go off and you do something and then you come back on the path. Whereas Steve Jackson's are much more complex, and you often require heaps of bookmarks for his books. So in my reviews, I'm going to be going over the background to the book. I'm going to be talking a bit about the author, about the illustrator, about the setting where this particular fighting fantasy book is set, because you do get some that are like sci-fi, set on totally different worlds. Then I'll talk about any sort of new mechanics that the book has, and also anything notable. And then I'm going to tell you about my playthroughs of the book, and then I'm going to give some ratings on difficulty, whether it was easy or hard, and the design, whether I think it's well designed as a game book, and also a rating on the story or theme, because some of the books feel like just a kind of random collection of interludes, whereas some really have a good flavor for the actual story. And of course, I'll give my overall thoughts on the book. As for which books I'll be reading, I do plan on reading the original 59, although I'll probably expand on that. Like there's the Steve Jackson 4-book Sorcery series, and then there are subsequent fighting fantasy books that have been published. And then who knows, once I've done all that, I may do Lone Wolf, but that's far in the future. So I'm pretty excited. I hope you can join me on my quest. I've set up a playlist which will contain every video that I publish in this series, so be sure to check that out. One last thing, I am currently reading one of these every quarter, so that means only 4 a year, so this will take 15 years at that rate. So depending on what other books I have on my plate, which is a lot, I may step that up at some point. And lastly, let me know in the comments how many fighting fantasy books you've read. Alright, I'll see you in the dungeon.